selected Métis regions 1, 2, 3, and 4. Recognizing that we are all treaty people, we seek to fulfill the spirit and intent of these treaties through an ongoing process, and we are committed to building stronger relationships that respect the Indigenous peoples of this place and strive to work together to care for the land, water, and all living beings who call this watershed home. I apologize, my screen, something happened here, so I'm just gonna fix that. Apologies, I'm having some technical difficulties here. Okay, I'm assuming everything is back okay for everybody. All right, so we have just a few housekeeping items before we get started today. So please don't use your video during the talks and keep your microphone muted. This is just going to help us with bandwidth and keeping the noise down. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat feature. We will have people monitoring the chat to answer questions as you go along, but most questions will be answered by the speakers at the end of the presentation. We'll also be having a couple poll questions along the way. So Mary Ellen, why don't you go ahead and launch the first poll question for everybody? And while she's doing that, at the end of the session, we are giving away a watershed gift basket. So we'll be drawing a name from one of our attendees for this basket, which includes a copy of our Living in the Shed book, as well as one of our camping mugs. So stay tuned to the end for that. Mary Ellen, are you able to get the poll going?
Yep, we've got responses coming in already.
Awesome. Feel free.
Yeah, looks like we ended that
whenever we've got a good number.
Yeah. Share results. Did that come up?
I'm not seeing it. Are you?
I'm not seeing it. Audience.
It's visible.
Yeah.
It's visible.
Yep.
Okay. And is everyone still able to see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Marielle, maybe you could read off the results because I can't see the poll.
So the majority of people are actually coming in from the NGO sector with 28%. And then in second place here, we've got quite a few municipal government members, as well as a few folks from the provincial government, other watershed stewardship groups, and some industry folks. So thanks everybody for coming today.
Wonderful. And if you could launch the second poll question really quickly, I will move on to you just discussing that at the end of our speaker series over the winter, so we had one in February, March, and April, we sent out a survey to all of the attendees asking them for feedbacks on topics that they would like to hear about. And we listened. So for the fall series, we're going to have 3 noon-hour speaker sessions starting today, of course, with wetlands. And then in November, we're going to have speakers talking about aquatic health. And in December, we're going to talk about water quality. So just as a note, all of these speaker sessions are being recorded and they will be available on our YouTube channel, as well as posted on our website. All right, and what are the results from the poll, Mary Ellen?
Sharing the results. So it looks like the majority of people said that if you were a wetland in Alberta, where would you want to be? And most people would want to be in a nature reserve. That makes a lot of sense. But I personally would love to be in the mountains in the second place. Some people right around, there's a tie for third and fourth place on the prairies in my own backyard. And nobody wants to be a wetland in a farmer's field.
Interesting.
Interesting.
All right. Well, let's continue on with this wetland conversation. I'm going to introduce our first speakers. So we have 2 people coming from Strathcona County today. We have Jocelyn Thrasher-Hobb, who is a professional biologist with almost 20 years of municipal experience with Strathcona County. She's responsible for managing a team focused on municipal environmental planning and policy development, Firstly, as a consultant, and secondly, as a municipal regulator, she's demonstrated an ability to identify and resolve complex issues with a variety of stakeholders regarding environmental planning within the context of increasing urban, rural, and industrial development. Applying 25 years of ecological assessment experience in context of conservation opportunities and planning challenges on the developing landscape has resulted in Strathcona County being a recognized leader in the application of conservation tools. She's also joined by Emily Kabatoff, who after completing her environmental science degree through the Augustana campus at the University of Alberta, Emily joined Strathcona County as an environmental analyst. Some of her projects include managing the conservation easement, contaminated sites management, and wetland replacement programs. She's currently working towards her professional biologist designation. And before working municipally, Emily delved into the conservation sector, working with the Alberta Conservation Association, Ducks Unlimited, and the NCC. Emily is passionate about combining conservation and biodiversity work with the municipal policy and planning. And so today they're going to be talking about Strathcona County wetland projects. Go ahead and take it away, Jocelyn.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Awesome. So Emily is going to be running the presentation because she is much better at technology than I am. So yeah, she's my backup. So thank you, Emily. Thank you very much for the invitation to present to the group today. I'm really looking forward to any questions or discussion or follow-up emails afterwards. That's always a really good networking opportunity since we can't be in the same room. Michelle has introduced us very well. It's painful reading out those bios, but we struggle through it, and I appreciate that. Yeah, so what we wanted to present today are just some of the initiatives that we've been working with within Strathcona County, and just to give you a little flavor of some of the challenges and maybe some of the positive outlooks that we're looking forward to here in Strathcona County, and obviously within the North Saskatchewan watershed area. So Emily, next slide, please. Thank you. So for those of you who are maybe not familiar with Strathcona County itself, we are a specialized municipality. We have an urban core, which is Sherwood Park, surrounded by a rural landscape. We're just over 1,260 square kilometers in size. Our population is just under 100,000, and about 2/3 in the urban area and 1/3 in the rural landscape. I started with the county back in 2003. Since then, the population has grown by about 26%. A lot of the development pressure has been agricultural, residential, obviously, but also acreage, industry, and recreation pressures as well. We are very happy to have a diverse landscape around us. We are nestled between the city of Edmonton and Elk Island National Park in the Cooking Lake Blackfoot Recreation Area. Just over 50% of Strathcona County itself is within the Beaver Hills Biosphere. So this is a landscape of lakes, wetlands, and mixedwood forest. We also have high quality class 1 and 2 soils within the northern part of Strathcona County. So we have both the urban and rural experiences reflected within our programming and some of our policy development. But the landscapes we have, we can work with, provide some opportunities to be creative. I'm going to start out with speaking to our environmental framework, because that provides kind of the overarching guidance from our elected officials and senior leadership. But we will introduce a few of our wetland initiatives in our discussion today. Emily and I are going to take turns trading back and forth, just so you don't hear one voice speak. And Emily is the expert on quite a few of our projects. So the environmental framework itself, water is one of the most important themes. We also reference the following programs that we're going to speak to today, such as our Wetland Conservation Directive, the Wetland Replacement Program, our Stormwater Monitoring Program, and a small but mighty little initiative for naturalizing our stormwater facilities. Council approved our updated environmental framework just in June, after almost 2 years of development. The environmental framework's outcomes and objectives create a common reference for collaboration and alignment between stakeholders to work together towards a future where healthy ecosystems support a healthy community. Innovative and supportive programs, plans, policies, and strategic initiatives will be embedded in the administrative and operational decision-making of Strathcona County. There are 6 outcomes within the framework: air, water, land, biodiversity, waste, and energy. And we integrated the ecosystem model to ensure alignment accurately reflects the inherent connectivity between the outcomes. So our water outcome is a simple but strong goal built on the work we have been doing in the last decade. In order to continuously improve water quality and quantity in Strathcona County, we commit to collaborating with our watershed partners and providing leadership by influencing planning and management actions that result in an adequate supply of quality fresh water. These are our 7 objectives on the slide here, encompassing water quality and quantity, education and engagement, future water supply, and our reliance on the North Saskatchewan River and its tributaries. Under each of these 7 objectives, there are 3 categories for reporting within the framework. And here is just some examples under each of those categories that we've provided. The innovative practices in action recognize and document what we have been doing since 2009 to achieve this objective. These are new and original plans, processes, and programs that involve multiple activities across the organization to realize new ways of operating and governing. Supportive tools in action are those plans, policies, bylaws, and standards that serve as a foundation for and substantiate innovative and strategic initiatives. And finally, our strategic initiatives to consider are plans, processes, and programs that focus on change. They require an investment of resources dedicated to accomplish an objective and will need to define a scope, budget, and timeline. So the next slide here is just a sample layout of the water outcome within the framework. It lays out the objectives, the practices, policies, plans, and tools, and the strategic initiatives. This shows the comprehensive list that is the backbone of the framework. So the remainder of the presentation today will focus on 4 innovative practices in action and supportive tools to meet the water outcome. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a high demand for country residential development within our rural landscape. While we had planning procedures in place, the tools under the Municipal Government Act were not being used to their full extent for reserve dedication. Starting in 2003, several policies were developed and implemented in order to support dedication specifically for conservation. As well, land use practices at the time were negatively impacting the wetlands and drainage courses across our landscape. These planning and land use triggers ultimately supported the development of a policy. The implementation actions were determined to reflect our place-based values while recognizing that we must work within the provincial legislative framework. We set the policy goal to align assessments and mitigation reports to ensure efficient decision-making and avoid duplication. The result would be no net loss of wetlands and within our jurisdiction, including ephemeral wetlands. So the Municipal Wetland Conservation Policy was approved back in June of 2008. No net loss of wetlands is the goal, supported by a strict series of mitigation activities. Clear criteria, defined outcomes, and green infrastructure principles were recognized. The policy guided the actions of administration and also guided developers and landowners on how to conserve wetlands. Next slide, Emily. Thank you. So through our planning and development process, all the wetlands are identified and infrastructure concepts and constraints are also identified. We require ephemerals to be identified and incorporated into the mitigation process as well. Ephemerals have been a significant issue with long-term management of surface water. They must be considered due to the function they provide on the landscape, especially in regards to extreme weather events. We start prioritizing natural areas to be avoided and integrated, and also determine those that cannot be conserved. Replacement of lost form and function is the final discussion and involves many subject matter experts to determine creative and innovative designs. We do work with a 3-to-1 replacement ratio. We understand that provincial ratio is from 1-to-1 to 8-to-1 based on the wetland function and classification. But for us, ephemeral wetlands and intermittent drainage features were being lost without mitigation. And so we continue to require their identification and conservation. So this is just an example of the pilot project that was underway in support of the municipal policy back in 2007 and 2008. The design process was parallel to the policy development here. So this is not a residential development, rather it was triggered by arterial road design. If you're familiar with Sherwood Park, this is Lakeland Drive, just in the northwest portion of Sherwood Park. So we were able to avoid, minimize, and replace. All those actions were realized within this wetland complex. And we actually realized almost a 5-to-1 replacement ratio after all was said and done and the design was completed. We did redesign the road to avoid the largest wetland area. And we provided stormwater management for the larger neighborhood basin. The large wetland is a Crown claimed wetland, and we do have an LOC approval in place. Because this design was integrated within a regional park, we do provide irrigation for those sports fields adjacent, but we had to be creative with some of the education and awareness. Because it's a regional park, there was a little less stewardship involved, so the education focus was slightly different. We looked at signs and directing communications with specific user groups. For example, the ball groups that have leases for some of the diamonds on the regional park site. So with our conservation policy in place, we have realized approximately 50 developments that have required a Water Act approval since 2009. About 25 of those have been completed and are in compliance with provincial and municipal policy. All of these have met or exceeded a 3-to-1 mitigation ratio. So the success of the policy has also been reflected in the incorporation of policy statements and goals within our municipal development plan. This was updated back in 2017. With that statutory foundation, we were able to update our wetland conservation policy and reclassify it as a directive to focus implementation on the processes that have been integrated into our municipal procedures. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily now.
Thanks, Jocelyn. So yeah, building on the successes of the municipal wetland conservation policy that Jocelyn has described, we saw the involvement in the new Wetland Replacement Program, or WRP, as the next logical step. The Alberta WRP aims to reestablish wetlands in partnership with Albertans by providing resources for collaborative restoration projects across the province. A priority of both the Alberta Wetland Policy and the WRP is to replace wetlands within municipalities and watersheds that have had the highest amount of lost wetland area and value since 2015, as well as areas of high historical loss. So AEP has identified their priority areas to target for implementation of the program, determined by both current and historical wetland loss, and it's categorized by the watershed units. So for Strathcona County, we were identified as a high priority area for wetland restoration, and this aligns with the North Saskatchewan watershed and then the Beaver Hill sub-watershed. And the Beaver Hill sub-watershed is shown by the red area on this image. The guiding vision, mission, goals, and policies that Strathcona County has in place, as well as the dedication to the Beaver Hills Biosphere and the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, demonstrates a commitment which aligns with the goals and purpose of the Wetland Replacement Program. So the county has been working with the province since April 2020 on integrating the WRP into our municipal work plan. We introduced the program to our senior leadership as well as our elected officials, and now have formally committed to the partnership by signing the MOU in the fall of 2020. Since then, we have put together an internal WRP committee to formalize the resources required to realize the opportunities for wetland restoration on our landscape. We have been before council a few times, introducing the WRP, garnering support for our proposed project sites, and addressing our budget process. The main purpose of our WRP committee is to facilitate the implementation of the program within the county. One of the key activities of the committee is to identify areas to target for wetland replacement projects. For the initial period of the partnership, we decided to focus on county-owned land. We determined that this would help us set up a robust program and get our feet wet with the experience prior to moving to potentially more complex projects on private land. The committee has now identified a list of projects that meet the overall intent of the program while also providing drainage relief for the surrounding landscape and infrastructure. Education and awareness opportunities were also identified as priorities for our projects. A new code of practice was developed by the province for wetland replacement, so we aimed for sites that would allow for projects to align with this code of practice. Some examples could include installing ditch plugs and creating wetland pockets along the fringes of existing wetlands or drainage corridors. The committee is made up of representatives with professional expertise or interest in wetland restoration from various departments across our organization. We also have a representative from AEP who sits on the committee, which is crucial for ongoing communication between our municipality and the province. We believe that this inclusive and multidisciplinary approach will be a key to the continued success of the program. So here are a couple of potential project areas that we have identified. First, on the left shows the Uncas School site. Here we have identified an opportunity to partner with the University of Alberta Faculty of Extension in providing the Restoring and Creating Wetlands course in August 2022. By restoring wetlands along the existing drainage courses, overall resiliency in the drainage basin will be increased. This partnership and the proximity of the Uncas School would provide additional education opportunities. Increasing the wetland area by designing and constructing wetland pockets along the drainage corridor would directly impact water capacity concerns and increase biodiversity into the system. And on the right, this shows the Vicinius Estates neighborhood. So this county parcel, the drainage shows a drainage corridor that has largely been channelized and ditched, which can cause flooding issues, mostly due to the speed of water moving through the corridor and general lack of water storage capacity. Restoring wetland area on the reserve will allow for the water to slow down and soak into the land before leaving. Restoring wetlands on this site would help to increase resiliency, provide education opportunities, increase biodiversity, and increase water storage capacity in the area. Both of these sites are within the Beaver Hills biosphere and have great potential for education and engagement. The committee has also discussed other potential project sites that may emerge from other initiatives within the county, such as the Astaton Creek Resiliency Study and regional parks. I am personally very excited to see these programs begin and see more wetlands restored and created on our landscape. So while the WRP focuses more on the rural landscape, we also have many initiatives related to wetlands within our urban area. One example is our Stormwater Quality Monitoring Program. The goal of this program is to collect data to understand the health and resiliency of the stormwater management facilities within the urban area of Sherwood Park. The program will fill data gaps and provide a baseline of water quality trends within the urban area. It provides rationale for management decisions, construction standards, and may even help inform provincial guidelines. The sample locations cover 4 drainage basins within Sherwood Park, are sampled in both the spring and the fall to allow the data to be interpreted at both the local scale as well as the drainage basin scale to allow for comparison between upstream and downstream impacts. All of our stormwater in Sherwood Park eventually makes its way to the North Saskatchewan River, and we find that using this data and observation really helps to inform other practices as well as educate our residents at events like our popular pond parties. A new initiative in this year in 2021 was informed and supported by the Stormwater Quality Monitoring Program. We targeted certain stormwater facilities for naturalization, or basically decreased mowing to increase the buffer widths. Naturalization carries several important benefits, including protecting banks from erosion and capturing rainwater, reducing stormwater runoff, which will avoid overloading our drainage systems and reduce the risk of flooding. These facilities play a significant role in providing habitats for pollinators, birds, and small animals. The Stormwater Quality Monitoring Program identified quite a few ponds which could benefit from increased buffer strips. Education and coordination across departments was identified as key for the success of this initiative. We have been working in conjunction both with our Recreation, Parks, and Culture Department and the Utilities Department to both implement the program, provide educational materials, and respond to questions and concerns. During the first few years of naturalization, we expect to see an increase in weed presence as they are opportunistic. They were maintained during mowing. However, once mowing is stopped, they are fast to grow. Once the grass and other plants catch up in growth, they will be outcompeted for light and resources and will hopefully diminish over many years as they are crowded out by our other naturalized plants.
Thanks, Emily. So just to wrap up, hopefully these actions that tie all our initiatives together resonate with some of you. We just wanted to identify a few key, I guess, considerations moving forward in your own organizations. Specifically, an acceptance of a conservation goal by all stakeholders. This is really important when you're speaking and trying to get some common ground between departments and perspectives. It's also key to have committed municipal administrators from planning to operations. Some of these decisions have to be consensus-based, and all perspectives have to be considered when moving forward. Public education is so important, and the opportunities never end. You have to continue with education and awareness throughout the life of a pond, of a wetland, of any of our reserves. It's just a continual opportunity to work with our residents. And then ultimately, the relationship with regulators between levels of government must occur to be successful and to really coordinate overall implementation of some of these programs. So if you have a network of municipal administrators supported by science and research and a landscape to be creative with, you can make a positive difference for your community and support our beleaguered wetland ecosystems. Thank you very much for having us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much to both Jocelyn and Emily for that wonderful presentation. It's very exciting to see all that you're doing. Let's see if we have a few questions. Danielle?
Just getting through them here. Okay, so from Kristen, they said, thank you for the important work that you're doing. How do you consider the wetland class, form, and type when you apply to the 3-to-1 replacement ratio? Or do you require replacement of like for like?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yes, and we have, we consider like for like. We have some diversity of wetlands across our landscape, but we found that when working with landowners and developers, it's pretty consistent with what we're replacing. So the like to like has worked for us, and the 3-to-1 has worked for us as well. It's somewhat easier when working with developers and residents. And the province has been quite supportive of us continuing down this path. In addition, ensuring that we're addressing the ephemeral and some of those seasonal drainage pieces that can cause a lot of grief for us operationally, for landowners. And it's maybe not as important of a discussion piece at the provincial level. So we're just trying to kind of cover all our bases and make sure provincial and municipal regulators are supportive of that.
All right. Mary Ellen, would you like to go ahead and launch the next poll?
Sure do. And it's up.
All right, and while that's happening, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And introduce our next speaker. So I'll give you a minute to fill out the poll there, and for Mary Ellen to share with us the results.
So the question is, what do you feel is the most important role of wetlands in your community? And most people responded positively to minimizing impacts from flood and drought. And then in second place here, we have providing habitat to improve biodiversity. And then a tie for helping improve water quality as well as recharging groundwater.
Wonderful. All right, thank you so much. Okay, so our next speaker today is going to be Scott Miller. He's going to be talking to us about Alberta's Wetland Policy Implementation Review. So Scott Miller is a facilitator, biologist, and podcast host who helps individuals, teams, and organizations build their best working relationships by removing the obstacles that come from different experiences, professions, and passions. Coming from a background of environmental consulting and provincial government service, Scott has led large, complex, multi-stakeholder projects involving water and land management, strategic planning, policy development, and regulatory change. With thousands of hours leading facilitated discussions, Scott is passionate about creating truly collaborative and inclusive conversations that can transform decision-making and build trusting relationships. So with that, go ahead and take it away, Scott.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here so that we have a look at. You guys can see that? It's all good?
Yep,
So,
we're good.
Yep.
Excellent. And thanks for that introduction, Michelle. For the Alberta Wetland Implementation Review, I was the project manager working with the Alberta Water Council and a fairly large project team that worked through this discussion. And the idea today is to touch on some of the results that came from that project around the review for the Wetland Policy Review. Now let's make sure I can change this. So I'm going to start off with just a quick sense of the purpose and the process that we went through with the project, just to give you a sense of how the project came to be before I get into the results. The project came to the Alberta Water Council. It was actually suggested by one of the members from the industry caucus for the Water Council to suggest that there was a need to take a look at how implementation of the Alberta Wetland Policy was going. It had been a few years since the Water Council had provided input on the policy itself. And the idea was to capitalize on the multi-stakeholder perspectives around the Water Council table to see how things were going, not necessarily to recommend a way forward or improvements that could be made, but really just a good discussion across all the sectors to see what was in need of improvement and where there were some successes happening. In the end, the sort of more specific objectives of the project, I should say, ended up being a discussion about the terminology and the clarity of the policy and its implementation guidance, the documents that go with policy. There was an ask from some of the Government of Alberta folks for some suggestions around how to build appropriate performance measures for the policy outcomes. And the last piece, which was kind of the main driver of the project from the beginning, was really to describe what kinds of challenges, what kinds of opportunities, and unintended consequences were coming from implementation, but from the perspective of the different sectors at the table. Now, I just want to reiterate that the idea was not to provide recommendations. It wasn't to suggest a path forward, but just to spend some time sharing perspectives from different sectors as to what they were seeing on the landscape. As far as Water Council projects go, this one was a little bit unique in that it was entirely virtual. We launched in November. Of course, the pandemic had already been going for a little while at that point, and we carried through till March. So a typical Water Council project takes typically around a year. We managed to complete what we were calling an expedited process in about 5 months. So essentially 60% faster than a normal Water Council project. And we did it all virtually. Now, our team was quite large, 22 members. I think there was 13 sectors involved. And they put in a ton of time to make that happen. So there was definitely an elevated level of effort. And we got to use some interesting new tools to make it happen, like a Miro virtual collaboration platform. it wasn't just sector discussions around a project table. There was also a survey that we designed and built and sent out to all of the sectors. And in fact, it was open to pretty much anybody who wanted to answer for a period in the, sort of the middle of the project. We had a pretty good response, 58 responses from a pretty broad cross section of the Water Council sectors, including sectors that weren't represented on the project team itself. So we had, excuse me, quite a broad response. All of that came together in a, well, through a set of discussions, and we had the survey to supplement, but it came together in this final report, which you can find now on the Water Council website. And the idea was really, the whole intent of all of the discussions and the survey response and everything was to support the continuous improvement of the policy, to kind of shine a light on places where maybe there was a little more effort required, places where successes were happening, and really support the implementation of the policy. What was very clear from the beginning, and it was agreed to by everybody, was that this was not a project about opening the hood on the wetland policy itself. We agreed that the policy had been approved and was being implemented, and so the real intent was to support the implementation of the policy. Okay. So I skipped one slide there, but that's fine. To get into a few of the results, I'll break it into the three sections that I talked about at the beginning, the three objectives. And the, excuse me, the first was an assessment of the policy terminology. So we took a look at the outcome and strategic directions as they're described in the wetland policy. And we asked the question whether people felt that those statements and their supporting guiding documents, so all of the documents that are available through Alberta Environment, that taken together, those were clear enough to support implementation. And the results were mixed, but as a general statement, most of the ratings suggested that all of these statements with their guiding documents were more unclear than clear. And there were two statements in particular that were a little bit higher in being in their sort of lack of clarity. And those statements were around managing wetlands by avoiding, minimizing, and if necessary, replacing lost wetland value. There was a fair bit of uncertainty around the if necessary portion of this. And also the enable flexible wetland management. There was some uncertainty as to what that meant. Now, to be clear, all of the statements were considered more unclear than clear, but these two were kind of the top rated unclear. The second, so that first piece was a fairly tight piece of the team's discussion. We relied on our poll a fair bit to provide us with results. But the second and the third portions of the report and of the project team's work around measuring performance and identifying challenges, this was based much more on the discussions of the project team. We had months of discussions around this idea of what are some potential performance measures that would be useful for identifying the outcomes or identifying progress towards the outcomes. And we started off with some fairly complicated performance measures, and slowly through our discussions whittled them down to the 5 that you see on the screen. And it may look like that these performance measures are relatively simple, but we felt that these were the measures that would actually provide the foundation for determining whether we were moving ahead in protecting wetlands of value, whether we were able to minimize loss, whether we were able to replace wetlands, etc. As you can tell, at least three, many of these three, the top three performance measures are focused really on, what's happening with wetlands on the landscape. And the idea amongst these was also to report them at sort of different scales, whether it was provincial, major watershed down to sub-watershed, so that the numbers would be helpful in managing wetlands sort of at those different scales. The last two are focused a little bit more on almost the regulatory system itself. So how long does it take for reviews to happen? Because we're looking for a system that is relatively efficient, and also for the money that is collected, are we getting the bang for the buck of the funds coming in and funds being spent? Now, we had to recognize too that implementation of the wetland policy was relatively new. It's only been sort of running for a few years, and the wetland replacement program had, I don't think it was even a year in place at the time we were doing this project. So it was not a case of looking at these numbers as part of the project. It was a case of suggesting things that would be helpful in monitoring progress. There was also a series of additional metrics that the project team felt was really important to list. Not that they would be specific to reporting progress, but that these would be the kinds of information that would be helpful in designing, maybe new aspects of implementation. They're not really measures that lend themselves to a definitive statement of progress. It's just sort of a snapshot in time. The wetland inventory was a key thing. It is the one piece of the puzzle that would enable all of those previous reporting metrics that we talked about. But the second portion of this is talking about the application requirements. Again, this goes to an efficient process, and the fact that we actually have a periodic review just to see whether or not they're still aligned, whether there's changes or efficiencies required. A best management practice review and an inventory of education and stewardship programming was really to see, whether the wetland policy was affecting how well best practices were being implemented, like whether the best practices reflected the policy and what kind of uptake there was. And the same with the stewardship programming. Was there still a demand for education? What kind of uptake was there on programming, and what was available out on landscapes, kind of to keep tabs on the sort of the state of how things were unrolling with some of the partner organizations supporting implementation of the policy. So the last piece of the project objective was to sort of assess the successes of implementation and some of the challenges that were encountered, and maybe suggest some opportunities. And you'll see that there's a definite synergy between the challenges that were faced and the opportunities. But to start off with, the team was very clear in stating that we wouldn't be in the current condition if we didn't have an approved wetland policy. That just having an approved provincial wetland policy was a big step in improving the management of wetlands across the province. It was the thing that enabled us to move forward and even have the discussion as a project team about how well implementation was going. Embedded within that, though, was the system, the mitigation and restoration system that the policy enabled. And while there were certainly discussions around whether people liked or disliked that program, what was recognized was that having the program actually enabled wetlands, that wetlands were being assessed, and that those impacts were being considered, and they were leading to restoration of wetlands. Now, it's still early days in implementation, so there's definitely a lot of room for more restoration going forward. And then the other sort of key success that came out of the discussion was this idea of we've actually had improved dialogue and education around wetlands as a result of the policy. There's a lot more discussions and as was just mentioned, interaction with municipalities around how will the wetland policy interact with municipal policy? How will these things turn into MOUs or other agreements to advance the whole wetland management process? Everybody was dying to get into the challenges. This was sort of what kicked off the project in the first place. There had been an observation that there were some issues with implementation and that we wanted to, as a project team, uncover some of those so that Alberta Environment could shift or adjust if they wanted to on implementation. Key among the challenges was the complexity of the policy. And there was a fair bit of discussion around the requirement for expert support in order to navigate the policy. Now, we weren't intending to land essentially a recommendation that it needed to go in one direction or another with regard to expert support. It was just to point out that this bar of having expert assessments, expert requirements, expert training, all of these things sort of raised the bar on the policy and made it more difficult to implement. Sort of tied to that, though, was also this idea that the regulatory efficiency, the ease at which people can move through the approval process is kind of tied to the complexity. And so for a business to be a bit more efficient and cost effective, there was definitely an opportunity, or they faced a challenge, which leads to an opportunity about improving the efficiency of the process. And then again, sort of tied back to complexity in a way is this idea that the assessment tools were not generally well understood, and that only certain aspects of wetland value, which is sort of the basis of the policy, were being considered. So the tools looked primarily at ecological aspects, and other aspects such as cultural were sort of a bit of an additional consideration that were not nearly as well built into the tool. And furthermore, people didn't understand how the tool was working. People would submit, consultants would submit reports with one value, and after an assessment by the department, a different value might come out, in which case it was not clear how the tool landed on the assessment, final assessment wetland value. Because there was that sort of lack of transparency, stakeholders in general were feeling that the tool was maybe not as trustworthy as it could be. And again, we weren't trying to solve the issue. We're just trying to point to the fact that this is happening, and then the next steps, whatever happens, can build from this basis of understanding. This idea that there was little transparency and very little reporting on progress against the policy was one of the angles that sort of led to the discussion around the reporting metrics. Many folks were thinking that the implementation was kind of diminished by not knowing how it was going, and that having some tools and some measures available in whatever form would be helpful in sort of taking that next step. And then there was the last point that was raised was around this idea of sufficient education and stewardship support, that while there was some material available and some support for various stakeholder groups to understand and try and implement the policy, that more support was needed, and that in specific, certain sectors needed to be handled different than other sectors. So agriculture is different than oil and gas, which is different from forestry, which is different from the environmental groups. That the education support required actually needed to focus on the specific needs of different sectors. So those were the, in essence, the 5 challenges that were pointed out. As you can tell, some of them sort of nest together to create a bit of a picture of the challenges being faced. But from those challenges, the project team identified some opportunities for improvement. Now, we're not, again, this was not recommending that we absolutely needed to clarify things, just some observations of the team that if these are the challenges we're facing, here's the kinds of opportunities we could consider going forward. Obviously, first amongst those is this idea that we can clarify the policy requirements, whether that's better guidance documents or different wording. That's sort of to be determined, but the idea is to clarify so that there was not as much reliance on specialized expertise, and so that your average person could move through the policy with a little bit more ease. We did have Indigenous partners with us at the table, and it was very clear that there was a need to have some open dialogue with Indigenous peoples around the province, so that the wetland policy and its implementation could consider some of those cultural aspects and Indigenous perspectives in the implementation. And last two, not too surprising in terms of opportunities, was this idea that we wanted to enhance the education programming that would support policy implementation going forward. And then the last was to improve public reporting. And again, that links back to the measures that have been suggested by the team. All of these things were put forward and accepted by government, and because it's not a recommendation report, it's not a going on the to-do list has in the same sense as some of the other Water Council projects, but it is and is intended and was accepted as a way to support continuous improvement, sort of shape how implementation might improve going forward. We had really good cross-sector support. Environment and Parks was very involved in the discussions throughout and providing background to the team and suggesting ways that some of the discussions could go. Like, these opportunities came about as a result of discussions that included Alberta Environment and Parks. And with that, there's just a few minutes for questions. I'll stop sharing and pass it back to you, Michelle.
Perfect timing, Scott. All right, it looks like we can go to the questions now, Danielle.
Okay, so we have a question from Kristen. It says, thank you, Scott. This review has been an important document in informing my work. I wonder if you can comment specifically on gaps in wetland policy implementation or specific challenges faced in the green zone.
Some of the if I'm recalling all the discussions correctly, so the main focus or main challenges in the green zone were around classification and inventory. Now, again, we're kind of recalling or summarizing sort of perspectives from across the different sectors. So what we were hearing was for implementation to improve, we actually need to know where wetlands are and what classes they are. And we had a fair bit of discussion around trying to figure out some of these things in advance. So it's very hard to plan when you don't know sort of what's happening with wetland policy or wetland classification until you get out there on the landscape. So this idea of I would say proactive inventory, but classified inventory was a big thing. And I would say for green zone, that's the biggest challenge. White zone, there's been a lot more effort expended in that area.
Okay. Does anybody else have any more questions? You can put them in the chat or you can raise your hand if you like.
I should say for the record, if I was to be a wetland, I would be a wetland in Hawaii. So
lovely. Who wouldn't want to be, right? Okay, So thank you so much, Scott, for giving your presentation today and for joining us. Thank you to all the presenters. So with that, we have one more poll question. And we also will draw for our prize winner today. So Mary Ellen, if you could take those two things away.
Yeah, so the poll is up on the screen now. How familiar are you with Alberta's wetland policy? And I will just, looks like most people have voted, so I'm gonna share the results. And most people are saying they're not very familiar. And then in second place, somewhat familiar, and in third place, very familiar. So not a ton of people feeling confident about the Alberta Wetland Policy at this point. So maybe an opportunity for doing some education in the future. I did I did do a draw, and Philip Meinzer is getting the basket. So Philip, if you could please tell us your mailing address and we will get it sent out to you as soon as we can.
Congratulations, Philip, and thank you, Mary Ellen. All right, so thank you all for joining us today. This is just a little friendly reminder now to have you sign up for our next Watershed Wednesday on November 3rd, where we're going to be talking about aquatic health work in the watershed. So thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.